words, no more investigations. We have had enough investigations. We need now action. And that action means, first and foremost, that illegal, inhuman, immoral blockade of Gaza has to end. As Amira Haas, the respected journalist from Haaretz, pointed out today in the newspaper, the blockade of Gaza in its milder form, but still severe form, it goes back 27 years. It started in 1991 during the First Intifada. The blockade was then significantly qualitatively intensified after the Hamas won the parliamentary elections, what Jimmy Carter, who was an observer, called the completely honest and fair elections in January 2006. The immediate reaction of Israel, followed by the United States and then the EU, was to impose this brutal blockade on Gaza, which at a certain point even prohibited chips, potato chips, baby chicks, chocolate from entering Gaza. And then after Hamas preempted a coup orchestrated by the United States, Israel, and elements of the Palestinian Authority in 2007, Israel ratcheted up the blockade of Gaza. Now, who's responsible for the current crisis in Gaza? First of all, we have to be clear about, okay, let me start with who's responsible. As you are no doubt aware, there's a proliferation of reports from the World Bank, from various UN agencies, UNCTAD, the IMF. They put out report after report after report after report, and there's a consensus. There's a consensus that the proximate cause of the horror in Gaza, the proximate cause is the Israeli blockade. It's not Hamas. There might be some Hamas responsibility, but it's so marginal, so minimal as compared to that blockade. Now, we have to be clear, and I don't want to get too dramatic about it, too emotive about it, but we have to be clear about that blockade. Number one, it's a flagrant violation of international law, because it constitutes a form of collective punishment. Number two, since 2012, the United Nations, and these are very staid, conservative bureaucrats who don't use poetic language. They started in 2012 by issuing a report in the interrogative, will Gaza be livable in 2020? In 2015, UNCTAD issued a report. It then used the declarative. It said on its present trajectory, Gaza will be unlivable in 2020. Now, bear in mind, literally unlivable. These are UN reports by professional economists. By 2017, the UN, Robert Piper, he said we were too optimistic. Gaza passed the unlivability threshold years ago. Gaza, as we speak, it's unlivable. Now, what does that mean concretely? 97% of Gaza's drinking water is contaminated. Now, bear in mind, of the 2 million people in Gaza, 1 million or more, 51%, are children. 1 million or more are children. Sarah Roy, who's the world's leading authority on Gaza's economy, she's at the Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies, in the latest edition of her standard work on Gaza's economy, she says, innocent people, most of them young, are slowly being poisoned by the water they drink. Now, Sarah is a very respected, cautious economist, or political economist, as she calls herself. Innocent people most of them children, are slowly being poisoned. That's what Gaza is today. Now, to get back to Nikki Haley, to get back to Nikki Haley, she said, what country in the world would do anything different to protect their border? Let's be clear. That is not a border, and that is not a border fence. Baruch Kimmerling, the sociologist from Hebrew University, the late sociologist, he said, Gaza is the biggest concentration camp ever to exist. David Cameron, the conservative British Prime Minister, he said, Gaza is an open-air prison. Haaretz, the most respected of Israel's newspapers, referred to the Palestinian ghetto. Israel's snipers are poised not on the border. They're poised on the perimeter. Call it a concentration camp, call it a ghetto, call it an open-air prison. And the people of Gaza, it's unusual in the world today. As the United Nations Relief and Works Agency pointed out, they said Gaza is different than all the other humanitarian crises. Why? If there's a natural disaster like a drought, people move. If there's a human-made disaster like Syria, people move. Gaza is the only place on earth where the place is unlivable and the people can't move. They can't leave. They're trapped. And then that raises for me what's the fundamental question. Even the human rights organizations, which haven't been bad, even they refer to Israel's use of excessive force. They refer to Israel's use of disproportionate force. Implicit in that language is Israel has the right to use proportionate force. Israel has the right to use moderate force. In fact, leaving aside the legalities and the technicalities, let's just look at the picture raw. Israel doesn't have the right to use any force. 2 million people, half of whom are children, are trapped, caged in an unlivable space where they are, to quote Sarah Roy, slowly being poisoned. Unless you believe that Israel has the right to poison 1 million children, it has no right to use any force against the people of Gaza. They have the right to break free from the cage Israel has created for them.
So, Norm Finkelstein, as we begin to wrap up, what do you think is the solution?
Well, there isn't a solution. You know, there's a lot of talk about big solutions. I think what we need to do now, we have to assemble an international team of respected jurists. I would include John Dugard. I would include Alfred de Zayas. I would include James Crawford. These are the top people in international law. And they have to present a plan to end the illegal blockade of Gaza. Now, Israel wants the protests to end. In fact, the people of Gaza, of course, have the right to nonviolently protest. Israel has no right to inflict that blockade. But for the sake of the people of Gaza, then let's just have a quid pro quo. The Gazans will stop demonstrating, but you have to lift that blockade. And I think the plan has to be presented by respected jurists and then garner the support of the leadership in Gaza, which I think they can win, and then from the UN community. In other words, no more investigations. We have had enough investigations. We need now action. And that action means, first and foremost, that illegal, inhuman, immoral blockade of Gaza has to end.